speak for approximately 15 minutes and then turn the remainder of the time over to questions. There are 3 floor mics to be used when answering questions. The first mic is behind the television stand, over there. The second mic is in the center, and the third mic is on the right aisle. The question will handle from left to right all the way across, and we will proceed in an orderly manner, one question taken at one time. Now John Price will introduce President Dreyfus.
On behalf of the Political Science Association and Steve Matson as president, I would like to welcome you here today to this meeting. On behalf of the association, I would also like to extend our warmest welcome to our honored guests and to thank them for accepting our invitation. Now it is my pleasure to present President Dreyfus, who will introduce the platform party and our honored guest, President Dreyfus.
Grades are over, Mr. Nixon. I think this event, as with some that we've had recently in the past, and I will inform you that we have other candidates coming on this campus, is an indication that the mass media environment has made us part of a mainstream and a main swing. This is not a Stevens Point speech, as our guest knows. I'm sure as most of you know, what is said here will be seen and heard nationally. You and I will be judged in part as a community of scholars by the nature of our questioning and how we are seen and heard. And it is our obligation to protect that interest so that all of you who have questions to ask or points to make, including our speaker, gets a chance to say what he has to say on the great issues facing our nation in this year, 1968. So I say to you, we accept the presence of the media, so that is not why we are here. Now on the platform, let me just take them in the order as they appear. John Price of our Political Science Association, and it is this student organization that has invited Mr. Nixon, now a declared candidate, to our campus. And next to him, Mrs. Pat Nixon. Genuine welcome to our campus, Mrs. Nixon. And thank you for bringing the snow. We're about to go into an ice carnival, and we really needed it. And next to her, my wife, Mrs. Dreyfus. Pretty cool that I've got to live with her, you know. The painter who just painted my home, he came to the door and he said to her, "Is your mother home?" I let a man like this paint my house. The president of our Political Science Association, Steve Matson. And now to our speaker. Mr. Nixon, in a sense, covers the nation from coast to coast, having been both California and now New York. It apparently is getting in fashion since you started the trend for political people to move to New York and declare residency, Mr. Nixon. Let me introduce to you simply our former Vice President for 8 years, the Honorable Richard N. Nixon.
Davis, all of the distinguished guests on the platform, and the distinguished members of the audience. It's a very great privilege and an honor for me to be here just prior to the Winter Carnival. I say prior to it. I'm afraid if I got here during the carnival, somebody would ask me to ski. I can tell you about the only relationship I have to skiing is something that has to do with something that I can't change, my appearance. I remember the first time I met Bob Hope in the year 1952, right after having been nominated for the vice presidency. And we were sitting together at dinner, and the photographers came up and they said, look at each other. You know, that's how they want to get you in some silly pose. Those are the only ones they'll use, at least with me. Anyway, and so we finally turned to each other, and Bob Hope, with that wonderful humor of his, incidentally, he has writers, but he can think too. He said, you know, Senator, when we get our noses together, what a wonderful ad for Sun Valley. Just to set the record straight on skiing, I did try it once, but I'm not going to try it now. I have only one need to get to my country. Now, I have been thinking of what would be appropriate to speak about in my opening remarks, because I can tell from the interest that I can feel in this audience and the interest that I saw outside that there are going to be a number of questions, and I don't want to filibuster too long. I presided over a body in which you learn to filibuster, and so I will not try to do it here. I perhaps should start by saying that I checked a little on this university before getting here. Picture on your president. He's an unusual president. I've never seen a president get that kind of a hand from the students before. Usually they get something else. I also found, incidentally, he's unusual in another respect. You know, when you come into a university, you ask the president, what was your specialty and the like, and usually it's philosophy or English or this or that or the other thing, and he told me communications and all of its great expanded forms. And I said, television too? Oh, yes. And I was just thinking what a difference it might have been had I met him in 1960. And incidentally, one thing, if I could make a self-serving statement, I often talk to my good friend Mel Laird about his district, and he's very proud of his district and the people in it. And I, of course, have some good line of communication with Governor Knowles and others. This is a great university. I can see its new buildings and the rest, but if there's one thing you need, it's a bigger auditorium, and I'll lobby for that. Now, we come directly to the subjects of interest, and perhaps what I can do at the outset is to lay a frame of reference, so to speak, for the questions that I'm sure will follow. Since this is a question period, I was thinking as we flew over here today from Green Bay of a question that I had been asked a few weeks ago when I was walking on the beach. Florida. Incidentally, this is a Florida 10, not makeup, that I'm wearing today. And as I was walking along the beach, a young student came up to me. I say young, he was perhaps a junior or senior in college. He was obviously from a rather affluent family to afford to stay in the place that he was staying in. And he asked a question, however, which was very perceptive and one that I have heard quite often from young people. And the question was, what do you have to say to the people of my generation? What do we have to live for? Here we are in this affluent society, and the purpose seems to have gone out of American life. what is the purpose? And then he went on to say something that is said over and over again these days by some of the younger people, not the majority, but by some. He said, we inherited a world we didn't create. I didn't give him a satisfactory answer. You know, they don't always come off the top of your head. And then after you leave, you think of what you should have said when you answered that question. And if I had the chance to answer the question today, it would be somewhat along these lines. True. Of course, everybody in this room inherited a world we didn't create. Of course, that's true every generation. But there's an exciting difference. You inherited a world you didn't create. But you can change the world. I couldn't have said that to people in America, young people, even 20 years ago. And I can't say it today and couldn't say it today to young people living in any other country in the world than America. And it's this exciting challenge that we must realize today. That because we live in America, and because of the time that we happen to be born in, as we enter this last third of the 20th century, that we are a unique generation. I'm referring we to you particularly, who will live to the year 2000. That we are a unique generation because we can change the world. Americans can change the world. It has not been so. It was not so in our past. And it is not so in any other nation in the non-communist world today. But it is so in America. Now that, of course, sounds rather Pollyannish and, shall we say, graduation-type commencement speech business, that this is the worst of times and the best of times, and there are great challenges, but also great opportunities and so forth. But let me get away from it and get down to some specifics. Certainly, this is a very dangerous time in which we live. You inherited a world which is more dangerous than the world has ever been before. I don't need to tell you that man now has the capacity, if he is involved in a nuclear confrontation, to destroy civilization as we know it. You inherited a world looking at the United States of America and its relationship to the world, in which the United States has never had more trouble in more places in the world than it has today. Or Vietnam, of course. There'll be plenty of questions about that. We all think of that as one of our major troubles, but consider the other parts of the world. Europe, the Grand Alliance of 7 years ago, is now a hollow shell, with the French about to leave it, and the British so weak that they no longer can influence, and the Germans being wooed by the Soviet. And unless there is leadership, that Grand Alliance, its economic and military capability, which is a major buffer between the communist world and our world, will go down the drain. Latin America, we tend with our superficial analysis to say, well, the problem is Castro, and he is a problem. He's got the strongest military force in the Western Hemisphere, next to the United States today. And he exports revolution all over the hemisphere. But even if Castro were to leave the scene tomorrow, in Latin America, we have a situation where, despite spending $9 billion over the last 5 years for the Alliance for Progress, that the rate of growth in that part of the world, our closest friends, our closest neighbors in our hemisphere, the rate of growth was less than in non-communist Asia, less than in communist Eastern Europe. In fact, unless there's a change, Latin America is going to be a permanent depressed area of the world for the balance of this century. And when the year 2000 comes 33 years from now, the per capita income of those living in the United States will be 15 times as great as these people with similar background to us in the United States, with all of the explosive possibilities that means, even if no Castros are on the scene. The Mideast, always a powder keg. And recently we saw that powder keg explode in a flash war which the Israelis won over the Soviet client states. And yet, despite that great victory for the Israelis, the big winner turns out to be the Soviet Union. It has a naval presence in the Mediterranean today. It is refueling the states which were engaging in aggressive and provocative action toward Israel. And, even more important, the Soviet Union today now has influence, immense influence, in the ring of states across the Mediterranean, all the way, as a matter of fact, from Iran to Morocco. Balance of power in the world, if we're going to think in terms of power. 7-1 in our favor 7 years ago, reduced to 2-1 today. Within 3 years, the point of greatest danger in the confrontation between the two nuclear giants is reached, because then, unless something happens with regard to our own leadership, the United States and the Soviet Union will be equal, and the Soviet Union, with its development of defensive missiles, will and may pull ahead. And that leaves out, of course, the possibilities of what will happen as China, the third great potential nuclear power, potentially great because of the number of its people and their creative abilities, which can and probably will be tapped in the years ahead. In 5 years, they will have a substantial nuclear capability, and if they are still outside of the family of nations, that will in itself be a tremendously explosive situation, which we may not be able to control. That's the underside of the picture. And in the United States, you can find plenty of underside things to talk about. The fact that crime is going up 6 times as fast as population, the fact that our cities exploded, 60 of them last year, the fact that despite the situation in which we're the richest country in the world, we face the highest interest rates in a century and the highest rate of growth, the highest increase in the cost of living perhaps in a generation, highest taxes in history, having to restrict travel abroad, something that has never happened in this country before, so on down the line. That's the great side. And now let's look at the other side of the picture. The other side of the picture, of course, is that we live in a time of change. Most generations are born in times when the world is not changing. And for centuries, up until the 20th century, people would be born and there wasn't much that they could do about the world as they lived in it, because the situations and patterns were fixed. But today, the world is in this process of change, a change in a number of respects. Look at the nations in the world. Half of them have been born since World War II. Look at the people in the world. Half the people in the world were born since World War II. Look what that means in terms of being able to develop new policies. As one Asian diplomat put it, the new generation, the ones born since World War II, the ones who will make the world in this last third of the century, will have neither the old hates or the old guilts born out of World War II. This affects the Japanese and all of those upon whom the Japanese imposed conquest. It affects the Germans and all of those who feared them. It means that these peoples can contribute, and those who, of course, were around them may also not have the same fears. These are an indication of the possibilities. But more than that, we inherited a world in which we have the capability to change the world. There was a time when the dire predictions of Malthus may have meant something. But today, when we consider the breakthrough in agriculture production, when we consider what we can do, for example, in the new areas of farming the sea, when we consider what nuclear power can bring, the developments in cybernetics, etc., things that you know much more about than I do, in this last third of the century, and this is the first time you could ever say this, in the last third of the century, it is possible to wage a winning war against poverty, against hunger, against misery, and possibly against most disease in the world. All of this can happen. Now we get back to the United States. What role does it play? I could give you the underside of that picture. You travel abroad, the United States has got a lot of troubles. You can find plenty of critics of the United States every place you go from. But on the other hand, I think we have to keep that in perspective by recognizing a very solid fact that is brought home by this illustration. Another university president, the very eloquent General Romulo, who is now the president of the Philippines, told me that one of the local Filipino politicians who had always been successful in his campaigns Wish I could learn his secret. But anyway, one of these local Filipino politicians had said that his method of winning was this. He said, give the Americans hell, but don't drive them away. That could be said for a local politician in Latin America, in the Mideast, and in Asia, all over the world. Because it works. Give the Americans hell, but don't drive them away. But let's look at the other side of the equation. While they don't like what we do in many parts of the world, while they envy our wealth and fear sometimes without justification our power, because it has never been used for conquest in this age, nevertheless, any individual who really knows that if we were to take the United States today and lift it out of the world, that the rest of the non-communist world would be living in sheer terror. Because without the United States of America in the world, no nation in the world could afford the luxury of the truck. And so here is America. We didn't ask for this role. We do not want conquest or domination or expansion. We would like to live within ourselves and handle our own problems. But because of what has happened in Europe and what has happened in Asia, and because of the fact that in Latin America and in Africa and in the rest of Asia, the development has not yet reached the point where any other nation could play this role. Today, the United States, with its faults, but with its great power, will determine whether peace or freedom survives, and what kind of peace or freedom is going to survive in the last third of this century. And so I conclude, yes, it is a difficult world, and you inherited it, and you didn't create it, and those of us who did create it made a lot of mistakes. But the exciting thing is, you can change it. You have the power to change it. The world is changing. It's looking for change. The old isms no longer have their appeal. Communism, socialism, Marxism, yes, even what we call Americanism no longer has the magic appeal that it used to have. The world is looking for the new leadership and the new ideas. And what you do can change the world. And I say to you today, as you go through your studies and as you look at the prospects of the draft and all the other things which I know hang over some of the men here, as well as the fears that perhaps some of the girls may have with regard to that matter, I can say to you, look at the other side. Never has a generation lived in a more exciting time or in a more exciting place than America. And now we're going to find out how exciting, because you're going to ask some very exciting questions. Thank you.
Over there. Bob, you want to take the mic and speak to folks?
Mr. Vice President, I know yesterday.
Now, Gilbert's coming next week.
Former Vice President Nixon.
That's all right.
I understand.
I didn't call everything, that's all right.
I understand that yesterday you said that the United States should formulate a new policy towards Southeast Asia. Would you care to elaborate on that policy, what it might be?
How much time do I have? Now, seriously, in referring to a new policy toward Southeast Asia and toward the Pacific in general, what I was referring to in my comments yesterday related to the kind of preventive diplomacy that I think we need and that we do not have, that will prevent other confrontations like the one we have in Vietnam. Let me explain it this way. In Korea and in Vietnam, the United States furnished most of the arms, most of the money, and most of the men to help these nations defend themselves against communist aggression. Now, we're a rich country, we're a strong country, we have lots of people, 200 million, but there are 2 billion people that live in the free world. And therefore, our policy must be one, looking toward the future, of preventing more Vietnams, if we possibly can, through peaceful means. And that, of course, is the first thrust of a policy. But second, in the event that there is an attempt to impose conquest through exporting and supporting a revolution, what we must do is to recognize that the goal of the United States is to help the nation involved fight the war, the insurrection, but not to fight the war for it. The problem in Vietnam and the problem in Korea before was that the Americans, with their efficiency and with their power, went in and we took over the major responsibility ourselves for the fighting as well as for the assistance. This in itself does not make sense when you look at the numbers of Americans and the numbers of people who have a stake in this. So the responsibilities for defense must rest on the peoples and the countries involved and the people in the areas and for others throughout the world who will have the same interest that we have. That's the beginning. The second point that I would make is this. In terms, and this is one which I cannot spell out in detail, but which I did spell out in considerable detail in an article in Foreign Affairs recently. In terms of avoiding a world conflict, it is vital that we develop diplomacy that reduces to the minimum those times when there is any kind of a confrontation between the superpowers. What I mean by that is this. Whenever the superpowers brush each other, as we did in the Cuban confrontation, as we almost did in the Mideast, and as we might in Vietnam if the war were to escalate, then you have the chance of the small guerrilla war exploding into a nuclear confrontation. How do you avoid that? Well, first, the best of all worlds would be one where there would be no guerrilla wars, where the communist world would quit trying to export and support revolutions. I do not anticipate that will happen, not in the foreseeable future. But the next best thing is to see to it that the countries in the area of Southeast Asia, all the way from Japan clear around to Thailand, develop, and I think they're now ready to do this, economic, political, and eventual military ability to handle their own security. The United States, in other words, rather than moving toward alliances with smaller powers that might be the subject of this kind of conquest, should move away from alliances and more toward encouraging collective pacts in which these nations will assume the responsibility themselves. Because every time we have a situation that the United States automatically must move in to any kind of a brush fire war, that means then that either the Soviet or the Chinese move in. And then you have the chance of a nuclear escalation. That's why I say we need a new policy toward Southeast Asia. This is beyond Vietnam. Policies and trade move in the wrong direction. Just as the move on to impose restrictions on American investment abroad. What we're doing right now in the United States, and as students of history, all of you will understand this, what we're doing is moving along the path that the British took, sadly, 3 to 4 years ago, dealing with symptoms rather than causes. And by taxing tourists and restricting that or restricting our investments abroad, we may solve a present balance of payments problem, but we inevitably are going to create others. Now let's look specifically at the taxing tourists first. When does it hurt the most? It doesn't hurt the businessman or the wealthy. What it hurts is a great number of middle-class Americans that by the millions travel abroad to Europe, because this may, as you know, applies only to the European and not to the American trade. Second, what nation does it hurt the worst? A nation which is a friend of the United States that can least afford the British. And to impose this on the British at this point and to reduce trade, reduce that there is, of course, a very great problem. And finally, we have to recognize this, that when we look at the total balance of payments between Europe and the United States, it's in our favor and not theirs. So when we impose restrictions that restrict tourists from going to Europe and spending money there. They naturally are going to reciprocate and have to reciprocate some way against us. So what we're really doing is killing the goose that lays the golden egg. I believe that the tax on tourists will not help in the balance of payments problem. I think it moves in the wrong direction, and I think that the direction to move in is for this administration, rather than saying that the problem as far as our dollar is concerned is what America spends abroad, is to recognize that the problem is what this administration is spending in Washington and start cutting there. That's what I think.
What do you attribute your last three losses to in your last three attempts to win political office? And what do you feel you have to offer to the U.S. citizen that will win your election this time?
So I missed the first part of the question. Would you
what do you attribute your losses to in the last three attempts to win political office?
Oh, I'm sorry. I suppose no man is an expert on his own elections, because he tends to be somewhat prejudiced with regard to his own performance and others. I would say that in terms of the election of 1960, and one half of the precinct would have changed the results. When I won 26 of the states and the majority of the congressional districts, that any minor decision could have made a difference, but then it might have made a difference in the other direction. I would be unable to say what kind of effect. As a moment ago, as I could tell from the reaction of this audience, that many people think it was my inability to come across on television. That probably had some effect. And I'm going to do my best to cure that this time, I can assure you. As a matter of fact, as I saw all of the people here at the Winter Carnival, and one of those fellows, I thought first it was a hippie that showed me this thing. Some people say, why don't I grow a beard? That will take care of the 5 o'clock shadow, but that was those problems too. No, seriously, this year, and unfortunately, when a political man makes this kind of a statement, has to be shamelessly self-serving. This year, I believe that I can win, and can demonstrate that I can win down this long primary road because of my understanding of the problems of the world, because I believe I have some solutions, not just for the problems we're presently in, but for the long-range problems. I'm thinking not just of how we can end one war, but how we can avoid others. And I think, too, that in the long primary road, that I will have an opportunity to, through meetings like this, with students, with people in all walks of life, to answer their questions, to learn their points of view, and then to be able to represent what is the best of America and furnish the leadership that America does not have at the present time. Let me put it in a nutshell. At the present time, I am not one of those who was one of President Johnson's violent critics on every score. I couldn't disagree more with those who nitpicking and fly-specking him about his accent and his style and things like that. That isn't the problem, the Johnson personality. The problem is this, that at this critical time in America's history, we are facing tremendous problems at home, and all that we're offering is politics as usual. Politics perhaps at its best, because he's a skillful one, and diplomacy as usual abroad. We need more than that. And I just happen to believe that after 14 years in government, including 8 years as vice president, and 7 years after that, in an unprecedented period when I could stand back, travel through the world, and evaluate these problems, that I have some answers that will solve some of the problems of America. If I can convey those answers to the American people, I will win. If I can't, I won't, and I shouldn't. And I will support the nominee of the Republican Party who will win.
Do you feel the United States has lost face with the federal crisis and how are we going to get our men and ship back if we do get them back?
The United States always loses space when in a showdown with shall we say, a third or fourth rate power, we're unable to do anything about it. The time to have acted, however, was before it happened. Because once these men, 83 men on the Pueblo, have been captured as they have been and are hostages, then, of course, it's all well and good to stand before an audience and huff and puff about let's go in and get them and sail a carrier in or something of that sort. It sounds very brave, but it means that those 83 men would be gone like that in the event that we took that kind of rash action. At this point in time, now that we've made the mistake, even after we were warned by reason of their belligerent and provocative action that this would happen, we've made the mistake of not providing some kind of cover in the area for the Pueblo so that this wouldn't have happened. Now all that we have is the area of diplomacy. And as far as the area of diplomacy is concerned, I am unable, not being privy, of course, to the confidential information that the administration has as to what they could do, what they are doing, what we can offer to the North Koreans, or what we, in effect, could get somebody else to offer to them in order to bring it back. We can just hope for the best, but I am not optimistic at the moment that we will have success. Yes, sir.
I don't wish to knock you by using this question, but I'd really like to know the answer, and many other young Americans would too, especially the fighting men. If you do become president, would you consider using atomic weapons in Vietnam?
No. I would not consider using atomic weapons in Vietnam, and I'll go further. I take a very firm line on Vietnam, as you probably are aware. But I would not use atomic weapons in Vietnam. I would not invade North Vietnam. And incidentally, I would not invade any of the other countries in the area of Vietnam for a fundamental reason. The goal of the United States in Vietnam must be to end this war in a way that does not produce a bigger war or another war. Now, how do you avoid a bigger war? You avoid a bigger war by not using atomic weapons. Now, with atomic weapons, we could finish off North Vietnam in an afternoon. And then we could well have an atomic war here in the United States the next day. That is why I do not believe that atomic weapons are feasible. I do not believe it is the right approach. In terms of expanding the ground war, we have enough on our plate in South Vietnam at the present time. That is why our goal should be to devote our efforts to winning the ground war in South Vietnam, pacifying South Vietnam, and limit our efforts to air power and sea power against the North, and then against only military power, where it serves the purpose of helping our men in the South accomplish their objective. Now, the other side of this coin, since you opened the subject, may I, if I could go a step further, because somebody else will, I'm sure, asked the question. I think that answers the question, how do we end the war without producing a bigger war? And that means by not engaging in what I would call rash escalation. On the other hand, the question might well be raised, why don't we do a few other things? Now, just happens, I brought along a piece of paper here. And incidentally, I think it's only appropriate that since these questions may not be asked, that I answer them now. It comes from a group here at the school, and these questions are very, very proper. We call upon you to show disapproval of President Johnson's Vietnam War policy by demanding that we negotiate directly with the Viet Cong as well as with the North Vietnamese first. Second, that we scale down the level of violence in South Vietnam. And third, that we unconditionally stop the bombing of North Vietnam in order to get peace talks underway. Let me answer all three questions generally and then specifically. First, we want peace. And if I thought that doing one or all of these things would lead to peace, lasting peace, I would be for it. But it's because I'm convinced that following any one of these courses would lead to peace now and produce another and a bigger war later, that I have to respectfully disagree with those who take this position. For example, negotiate directly with the Viet Cong as well as with the North Vietnamese. An extension of that means let's form a coalition government with the Viet Cong. Why not? Because if you will read the North Vietnamese captured documents, you will find that they would consider that to be a victory for them and as the first step toward a complete takeover of South Vietnam. Now, we can talk all we want about the Viet Cong, and you can argue this point. Some people do argue. But the National Liberation Front, that expression is a clear description and an accurate one. The Viet Cong are controlled by the North Vietnamese. They're officered by the North Vietnamese. They are not independent. And unless you are able to get the North Vietnamese to come to the conference table, the war will continue. Let me put it in the other direction. If North Vietnam, at this point in time, would stop its support of the Viet Cong in the South, if it would quit not only sending men to the South and withdraw those that are there, and quit sending military supplies to the South, the United States would not have to assist the South Vietnamese. They can handle the Viet Cong by themselves. It is North Vietnam, its control of the situation that is the problem, and not the Viet Cong. And negotiating with the Viet Cong, forcing the South Vietnamese to do that, setting up a coalition government with the Viet Cong, would only mean that the North Vietnamese would have accomplished their objective and that we would then be looking at another war in another area. Because if they succeed here, then the business of exporting revolution, conquest by exporting revolution, will be encouraged and will be tried elsewhere. How about the level of violence in South Vietnam, scaling it down? Of course we would like to scale it down. But who is raising the level of violence in South Vietnam? We sometimes forget that 75,000 civilians, not Americans, not South Vietnamese soldiers, but civilians have been murdered in South Vietnam over the past 3 years. And the violence that we read about in the last 2 months or 2 weeks, this has been not the scaling up on our part, but the scaling up on the part of the enemy. If they are scaled down, we, of course, can scale down. And then finally, why don't we stop the bombing of North Vietnam in order to get peace talks underway? That's an appealing thought when you first think of it, because you know you've often heard it said, talking is always better than fighting. And like all those general statements, it's only half right. Talking is better than fighting if it's either or. But where the communists are concerned, as we learned in Korea, when we talk, they fight. Never forget that after truce talks began in Korea, 18,000 American dead, more than died before the truce talks began, occurred. We must not let that happen again in Vietnam. And as far as the bombing is concerned, the bombing that we are doing in North Vietnam, limited strictly to military targets, is solely for the purpose of assisting our men on the ground in the South. I say that it does not, and certainly should not be, the policy of the United States to ask young Americans to go abroad and then not to give them the air power to back up what they are doing on the ground. And I say, as far as bombing is concerned, just to stop the bombing if they start talking would leave the enemy in the South with an advantage over our fighting men that they simply shouldn't have. We should stop bombing when they stop fighting. And this we can de-escalate, of course, gradually. If they stop on a gradual basis, we, of course, can consider what we can do in stopping bombing. But the idea that by stopping bombing we're going to have peace, it just ignores completely the track record. I would say finally on that point that looking at Vietnam, we've had some rather bad news out of there. And one thing we want to bear in mind is this. The South Vietnamese have suffered greatly. Our forces have suffered greatly. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong have suffered far more. It was, as Washington points out, a military defeat for them. But that wasn't what they were after. What they are trying to do is to win the war in Washington, in the United States, diplomatically and politically, that they're unable to win militarily in South Vietnam. I think they miscalculated. The United States doesn't want to destroy North Vietnam. We don't want to conquer it. Our only goal is independence for South Vietnam and the same for North Vietnam. But I think we've got to make it quite clear that the United States, as a result of this terroristic kind of attack, is not going to do what the French did 12 years ago. I would say finally this war is going to end when three things occur. When the North Vietnamese are convinced that they can't win the war politically in South Vietnam, when they can't win it militarily, and when they're convinced they can't win it politically in the United States. And there is nothing that could contribute more to bringing this war to a successful conclusion than to bring home to them that the United States has no designs on North Vietnam, but that we are not going to participate in a settlement which rewards aggression and produces another war. When that gets home, and when they realize the United States and our people are united behind that, then this war will come to an end very soon.
Sir, I come from an area in the state of Wisconsin that is, we would think, economically and socially underprivileged. And through the now President's war on poverty, through the Office of Economic Opportunity, with your neighborhood youth corps and the Community Action Program, I can see notable advances that will make us become part of the affluent society. In the summertime, I'm a counselor for a federal program called Upward Bound. And this is, we take inner core area students out of Milwaukee and Indian students and poor, underprivileged white students and put them in an environment where we help to make them become part of the affluent society. This is all accomplished through the President's war on poverty. I'd like to know if you are in favor of this war on poverty and if you would continue to support such a program, and if not, what alternative program you would propose.
I favor those parts of what is called the war on poverty that have been successful, that have been efficiently operated, and that have accomplished the objective. In addition to the one that you referred to, which obviously is one of the most successful programs, I can also think of some that have dealt with youth, preschool children, and the rest, which incidentally was originally, as you may recall, a Republican proposal. Not that that made it altogether good, but it was. Well, Larry reminded me of that from time to time, and he's correct. But the difficulty with the war on poverty, if I may say so, is this. It doesn't go far enough. It doesn't go far enough in several directions. When we look, for example, at very good goals and intentions of the Job Corps program and some of the others, and the results, we find that the tendency has been to put too much emphasis on the principle that government can end poverty, and too little emphasis on what individuals and people in private enterprise can and should do to end poverty. And I think we need to bring into play, in order to, for example, handle the problem of our cities, build the housing in the slum areas that is needed, the new businesses that are needed there, bringing the jobs to where the people are, the new programs that your own president is developing, very exciting ones about building an entirely new society that will not just have everybody congested in cities. Let's have a combination of rural and city life, perhaps, in an area like this. What I'm suggesting is this. We need, what we do not have under this administration, tax programs, federal credit programs, federal incentive programs, on an exciting, imaginative basis that will wheel into action private enterprise into these jobs. Let's face it, where jobs are concerned, let's remember that jobs, the greatest creative jobs, are not government but private enterprise in this country, and they can do the job if we give them the incentives, and this administration has not recognized that in its policies, and a new one will. I think in terms, for example, of the building of cities, as Senator Percy in his housing bill provides. What we have to do is to provide again the incentives for private enterprise to go in rather than they have government do the job. When it comes to the matter of businesses, and here we've got a bipartisan program. Senator Javits and Senator Kennedy have a program which will have industry go into some of the ghetto areas and provide the jobs right there for them. There are a number of other imaginative proposals. I, for example, feel that we can have a national job census and a national skill census and a national job bank. After all, if we can use computers to get a boy and a girl together and marry them, certainly we can bring the man and the job together with computers. And the computer expert, I think, will agree with that. So what I'm suggesting is this. The goal of ending poverty, the goal of giving everybody an equal chance at the starting line, the goal of Head Start and all the rest. Believe me, this we are for. But the difficulty with this administration is that it has put too much faith in government and too little faith in people. I happen to believe that government has a role to play. But whenever I can get private enterprise in the job, I know that it will do it more efficiently, it will do it faster, and that's what we're going to do when we get it.
Before I came here today, I thought you were a reactionary, but after your opening statements, I would conclude either you want radical social change in the world or you're a liar. Now, I think we got to get specific about some of these things. For example, in Latin America, specifically, would you allow the right of revolution in Latin America against military dictatorships? That same right our forefathers had and used, and is preserved in our Declaration of Independence. You talk about radical social change in Latin America, a place where more children are malnourished than healthy. What specific programs? If you're going to have radical social change, you're going to have radical programs. What radical programs for the Latin Americans do you offer? Or are you going to offer another Alliance for Progress that sounds great and goes to the people, and the people get excited about it, but soon they find out that there's nothing to it? And if you do this, the next president of the United States, you chance being spit on again by the Latin Americans. Thank you.
Latin America needs radical change. It needs a revolution. Let me tell you first what I would not favor, and what the people of Latin America, including the young revolutionaries, do not favor. And that is to impose on the new nations and the old nations of Latin America what Castro has imposed on Cuba. One of the exciting things about Latin America's development since the Cuban Revolution is this. Communism as an ism, as a method, no longer has appeal in Latin America. Why? Because it's made a depressed area out of Cuba and has not done the job that it should have done there. And you will find all over Latin America, the new revolutionaries, they will talk against the militarists, and they will talk against the status quo, but they also talk against Castro because they realize what he has done to the per capita income, what he has done to the GNP, and without the Soviet help, what he would have done to the country generally. And so as far as the future of Latin America is concerned, it needs a revolution in several directions, and let me cover it very, very briefly. And I can be quite precise. This is another speech that I could make. One, Walter Lippmann, a man with whom I happen to disagree completely about Southeast Asia, but I agree with him on Europe and Latin America, wrote a column, little noticed, because it was a positive column, and usually the negative ones, and those are the ones that get through, as you know, about Latin America. And what he pointed out was that we must, in effect, implement the dream of President Barrunde of Peru. And that means that Latin America, in which you've got 200 million people living basically on the perimeter of a great continent, must open the center of the country. Many people talk about Latin America's problems as being overpopulation. It's an underpopulated continent. Birth control is only a temporary answer and not a necessary answer in Latin America, because if we can go down the center of Latin America and with $500 million concentrated on building the great highways down the center of that continent, which will unite the peoples and unite those struggling and competitive nations and open up the heartland, This will do more in the next 10 years to raise the standard of living of Latin America than all of the so-called handouts to raise their standard of living would otherwise do. So I begin with that. Let's do the practical thing of opening up the center of Latin America, which unifies them, brings them together, makes the common market a possibility where today it's just a dream that will never occur before the year 2000. Second, agriculture. The difficulty with some of the revolutionaries in Latin America, they say that what we do, and the same mistake was made in India, we must industrialize. Industrialization, of course, will come in Latin America, and sometime it will come in India. But the problem in Latin America at the present time is not failure to industrialize, but failure to do what this state and what this nation is so good at, and that is to develop modern agriculture. Take Chile. Chile is a country with more arable land than the state of California. And yet Chile imports $250 million worth of products every year in order to feed a population of 7 million. Why does this happen? It happens for several reasons. Let's look again up to Peru. Belaunde said 50% of everything produced on the farms in Peru spoils on the way to find the market. And the same is true in Brazil. In that great, sprawling country of 60 million people where you see such terrible poverty, and believe me, you have never seen such poverty you will see in the Barrientos and some of the places down there, the Cabel's in Peru, in Brazil. You will find that 45% of everything that is produced spoils on the way to farm the market. What we need to do is to take this area, agriculture. Here's something we can export. Not our products. That when people are hungry, yes. But rather than giving them the food, let's teach them how to grow the food and how to store it and how to produce it. And that means that we can certainly export that know-how on a much